Yes. That might be nicer, is it?
Yeah. So he's given me this. If there's a problem, I'll just lift. Is there a... Good morning, everyone. I hope you had a really good breakfast, because we're going to give you something even better just now. We're going to give you the session on accelerating future outcomes, trade, investment, and services. The context for this session, I guess, is very interesting for all of us. We are in difficult and interesting trading times today globally. The World Trade Organization expects global trade to grow at some 4% this year and next year, which is the fastest rate it's grown in the last 6 years. Asia is at the center of this upturn, yet there are some dark clouds on the horizon. The first of these is an escalating trade war between the United States and China. A second aspect is the unfolding crisis in emerging markets, which stretch from Argentina right through to Turkey. Now, Sri Lanka has had an open economy stance since 1977 with various degrees of openness, some steps forward, some steps back. The new government has put in place a national trade policy, is liberalizing para-tariffs, emphasizing FTA regionalism with the Sri Lanka-Singapore agreement in effect, has negotiations with India and China on 2 important FTAs, and is reforming the investment climate. So there's a lot going on domestically in this international context. So for this session, we are supposed to look at making trade and investment reforms effective. There are at least 4 questions. First, how do we make these multiple trade initiatives, FTAs, FDI regulations, national export strategy, etc., better synchronized with Sri Lanka's overall policy? Second, like with all initiatives, do we need some refinement of these initiatives, some fine-tuning? What should we be doing? And do we have to get the implementation agencies better joined up? A third question is services development. What is next? We've got the port city, and there's other things going on. And the last question is, how does the private sector, large firms, SMEs, gain from these changes? And how do we spread the benefits out of Colombo into the rest of the country? Now, to answer this set of questions, we've got a terrific panel around us, and I'm delighted we have good gender balance. If I ever do this again, I'd really like there to be even better gender balance than this. So we have Dr. Rajat Kathuria and Nihal Pitigala, who are respectively the Director and CEO of the Indian Council of Research on International Economic Relations and a World Bank consultant and USAID consultant. We have 4 panelists, Anush Amerasinghe, MD, CEO of BPPL Holdings, Ms. Nadie Kahatapitiya Algama, Director, Marketing and Strategy, KIK Lanka Private, Subhashini Abeysinghe, Research Director at Verité Research Private, Reyaz Mihalua, Managing Partner at KPMG. So the way the session is going to work, and we want to make it very interactive, because in Sri Lanka we are famous for our monologues. We want to make this a proper dialogue. And my colleagues and I agreed that we want you all to have some fun. So Nihal and Rajat will speak for about 10 minutes each, and then our discussants will speak for about 3 minutes each. And then I will try to pose a question of each panelist, something that's topical locally that I think would be of business interest. And then we will open it up to the floor through the app that is what's being used for Q&A, and we hopefully should get a couple of rounds. Towards the end of the session, I will give the speaker a chance, each speaker, a minute each to come back with their main point. whatever it is that they think that Sri Lanka should be doing in response to the new environment and in response to this multiple set of policy initiatives that we're developing here. And then I will attempt to summarize what I think are the key things we should be worrying about for Sri Lanka going forward into 2018. We've got, 3-4 months left, and the rest of 2019 as a way of boosting our trade-led growth. And then finally, a really important thing, we have an essay competition, and so I will invite the CCC head to come and present the prizes. And that's the youth of today, so I think is even probably more important than what we have to say. So we'll start. Rajat, would you like to start? Go down there if you like.
Thank you, Ganesh. At the outset, let me express my profound and profuse gratitude to Ganesh and to the Sri Lankan Economic Summit for inviting me here. It's an absolute honor and privilege to be speaking to this august audience and a formidable set of panelists. So I'll jump, since I have just 10 minutes and Ganesh is a very strict taskmaster, I'm going to start immediately. I'll try and answer 3 questions, and there are slides, but I won't necessarily go through the slides in the order in which I have them. I'm going to try and answer 3 questions. The first question, and I think Ganesh has set this out really well. The first question is sort of anchored around the US-China trade war, and specifically, what are some of the advantages that India can derive, or are there any advantages that India can derive from that? Then I'll talk a little bit about India-Sri Lanka trade relations, and then the way forward. And I was really asked to look at what are the lessons that Sri Lanka can draw from the Indian experience in its engagement with trade. And before I start that, let me say that India's engagement with trade, pre-1991 was a little ambivalent. In fact, it was a closed economy. Post-91, India opened up, and it's embraced free trade. Still, there's a long way to go, but there are benefits that have accrued and have been leveraged and captured by India because of its openness. But one of the things that often, I think, sort of constrains policymakers, not necessarily academics, constrains policymakers in India post sort of openness, post FTAs, post multilateralism, all of that has been the sort of parametrization or the measurement of current account deficit with respect to each individual country. And I think that's a mindset that exists. I'm sure it exists in Sri Lanka as well. But that's a mindset that exists in India. And I think one of the things that we must try and do is that, while bilateral trade is important and current account deficit with respect to each individual country is important, there is, I think, a risk in taking that argument too far, because deficits add to a country's competitiveness, deficits add to a country's sort of exports, because you're now, in a sense, participating in global value chain. So I think that's the overarching message that I want to leave, that there is, I wouldn't say an obsession, but there is too much attention paid to, and this is a reflection of what is happening in the current environment as well, between US and China. I won't go through, Ganesh has already said that there's likely to be robust growth in trade, and I hope that holds out, but at the same time there's a growing amount of protectionism in the world economy. And one of the things, and this is exactly what I said, one of the things that has sort of been the trigger to this development of between US and China has been the growing current account deficits between US and China, and all of you know that. There's huge surpluses that China enjoys, and therefore the deficits. But as I said, obsession with one country's bilateral relations can be taken too far. Now, if I leave this sort of in your minds, in the background, And given that there is sort of tension between US and China, the natural question that you begin to ask, and we have begun to ask in India, is there any advantage? And I won't go through this slide. You can please have a look at this on your own, and the slides will be there for you. Is there any advantage that India can derive from this growing trade tension? Of course, there is advantage that India can derive. It can get increased market access, especially in China, because there are exports that are complementary in the same category that India exports to China. But the question we must ask is that this has happened in the past, in the sense that there has been a growing wage in China. There's been growing, increasing costs of labor. And the question was asked of India 5 years ago, will that advantage you? Is that going to benefit India if China is becoming less competitive, and will then foreign direct investment come to India and use India as the base for exports? Unfortunately, that was not completely realized. A lot of the foreign investment that was of Japanese origin, that was of Chinese origin, that was of Taiwanese origin, etc., even some Sri Lankan investments, they did come to India, but a lot of them went to countries like Cambodia, to Philippines, to Vietnam. And that's the second thought I want to leave with you, which is that unless you engage in domestic reform, what people call the Ohio principle, put your own house in order, it's unlikely that you will be able to benefit from developments of the world economy. And it is a time today, and I'm sure it will be a time for Sri Lanka as well, that there is no country in the world before us that has benefited sort of from, or has managed to grow without taking the advantage of global markets. Unfortunately, global markets are becoming more closed, more protectionist, but if you look at the development trajectory of Korea, of Japan, and China immediately before us, they have benefited from openness in global markets. The domestic takeoff or the growth cannot happen by relying on the domestic market alone. And I think in Sri Lanka, of course, you understand this, given that you have a smaller domestic market. In India, often we don't appreciate the fact that the domestic market is not enough for competitiveness, for productivity, for takeoff. You have to keep foreign markets open. You have to leverage foreign markets. Given that they are becoming closed today, India needs to demonstrate that it is willing to keep its own market open, to try and prize open global markets. And that's a challenge that we face in India. If you want to attract more foreign investment that is coming out of China, if you want to access markets like China and the United States, you have to put your own house in order. You have to become domestically competitive, and you have to, in a sense, put your money where your mouth is, so that you're able to take advantage of global markets. And as I said, you cannot become competitive by relying only on domestic markets. And sometimes in India, we feel that the rest of the world will come to us because we have such a large market. Yes, they will, but we need to also demonstrate that we are willing to go that step further. So there are significant opportunities that exist in India in trying to sort of take advantage of global markets. And the last couple of points, and I'll talk a little bit about India-Sri Lanka trade relations, but there are risks that are emerging in the horizon. And as I said, it's going to be even more of a challenge in the next 5, 10 years. And I'm not even talking about climate change, of course, sustainability. I'll just talk about, current account deficit, of course, in India is rising, and that's a sign of, one sort of manifestation of that, one reason for that is because oil prices have gone up recently, and India imports almost 70% of its oil requirements are imported, and therefore this is reflecting not only in inflation, but it's also reflecting in current account deficit. And so, again, I go back to the previous point I made, is that the bonanza that had come as a result of declining oil prices in 2013-14, a lot of that time we could have engaged in domestic reform. We did do GST. India did do sort of improvements in trade facilitation, but I don't think we went enough. I mean, in the last budget, tariffs were raised to try and encourage domestic manufacturing, and I think that's not the right way to improve domestic manufacturing. You have to improve the environment of working within the country if you have to improve domestic manufacturing, and that links to what is called the Make in India program, or what the Americans are calling Make in America, or Make America Great Again. It's the domestic market that is important, and there is, I think the World Bank's research clearly shows, it's unambiguous, that a 10% reduction in tariffs versus a 10% improvement in the ease of doing business, or the 10% improvement in, let's say, trade facilitation or logistics, provides a bigger bang for the buck than the 10% reduction in tariffs. Of course, we are now moving away from tariffs in some sense and focusing much more on non-tariff barriers, because the WTO has been successful in reducing sort of tariffs from very high level to significantly lower levels today. Of course, it's raising its face again in the face of US-China trade tensions, but the focus much more is on non-tariff barriers. But in addition to that, and the lesson that I sort of bring from India is that you should have better domestic operating environment, and that provides much more improvements in terms of productivity, in terms of competitiveness. And my time is over, but my last point is on India, and I'm happy to come back to this in the question-answer session, is that, what is the future of India-Sri Lanka trade relations? And as Ganesh said, there is an ECTA that is being negotiated, and there is optimism that by the end of this year we may sign that. Again, I would appeal to Sri Lanka, the point that I made a little while earlier, is that, given the difference in market sizes, given the sort of geographical proximity, one country or the other will run a current account deficit, and in this case it is Sri Lanka that runs the current account deficit. But I think too much focus, too much attention on the current account deficit, just as India ought not to focus on the trade deficit that we have with China. Similarly, that's the same advice. Of course, policymakers, the political economy sometimes makes it sort of almost the immediate reaction is, oh, why do we have a current account deficit? Because we didn't negotiate our FTA properly. While that may be so, there is another reason why India has a current account deficit with China. Maybe we are not as competitive enough. And I think that is the lesson to draw and to say, how is it that I can make my economy more competitive? And tariffs are one way, but as I said, focus on improving the environment within the country, and that will provide much more boost to, in a sense, the trade and competitiveness than an equivalent reduction in tariffs. And again, another important point, and this is the last point I will make, that Ganesh made, and sometimes it sort of escapes trade economists and trade theorists, because trade theorists only look at trade and say trade is a non-zero-sum game. Yes, it is. It's a positive-sum game. But there's less attention given to the sort of distribution effects of trade. And that the distribution effects of trade often trade economists especially, ignore, but it's important. And if you engage in domestic reform, then I think those benefits will be better captured and will better percolate down than if you do not engage in domestic reform. So another reason for putting your own house in order, I think, is the distribution effects of trade. My time is up. The slides are here, but it's been a privilege speaking to this audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rajat. Nihal?
I think to get to it straight away, let me first thank Ganesh and the CCC for organizing this. Friends and colleagues, I think Ganesh and Rajat address a couple of very important points that I wanted to sort of follow up on. Rajat mentioned about the domestic market, the importance of getting your house in order. And given the size of the market, how much trade matters. It's no longer a mystery anymore, the size of the market argument for trade for a small country. The other thing is the turbulent environment that we encounter every few years. The latest is the US-China trade war that has spillover effects. I mean, I think sane heads prevail. Eventually, we would assume that this will come to some sort of reasonable settlement. But one in a country who does the policy has to assume if worse take place, how do you respond to these things? But let me address the main theme of this seminar by highlighting one important thing. I let the graphs do the talking, but I will let you know what exactly behind this. I wanted to just focus on this graph here. It looks like a snake that's raising its head. And can you spot where Sri Lanka is? This is a graph that depicts, you heard about GSP Plus, you heard about all the preferential trade that we have negotiated over the past few years. Where Sri Lanka is, we are below zero. What does that mean? Which means that all these exports we make in the international market, we are at a negative preference. Let me put it very simply. We negotiate a free trade agreement, and the tariff of that partner is 20%. We are given a 10% preferential tariff. What has happened? They also sign agreements with other partners. And eventually what it turns out to be, we are on the negative side of that preferences. What does it say? It principally says this to us. Sri Lanka has to build resilience beyond what other countries offer in terms of preferences. This is my fundamental storyline. I'll get that. It's all about building resilience. And the back of that, which I want to highlight it, a lot of you and some of you already know that there is a trade policy that exists, which is very carefully crafted, which lays out the parameters for Sri Lanka's trade growth and export diversification. It's out there. And one of the fundamental principles we instill in that is for need for Sri Lanka to grow beyond the static form, to structurally to transform towards a high-end country. Now, these are not lofty aspirations. Like a company, most countries in the world do set these standards. And you've got to have these standards, demarcations, what you are trying to strive towards. So with this background, understanding resilience is important. The trade policy plays a catalyst role. This catalytic role trade policy plays comes in various forms. Just to add to misery, let me bring this graph as well. Have a look at the red dotted line, which is Sri Lanka. What this basically says is that Sri Lanka has been exported multitude of products overseas, but their sophistication hasn't moved an inch since 1991. This is where we were. And it has stagnated all the while. And if you look at it, we are below that peak. That's the Everest, and that's Annapurna. So which means our technical sophistication hasn't budged over the last 10 years. Now, these are staggering numbers. Let me come back to the way forward. So I mentioned to you that there's a trade policy exists, which is very well articulated guiding principle. What is the main pillars of this trade policy? The first of it is getting the incentive structure right. Now, what do I mean by the incentive structure? To make sure that the Sri Lankan domestic market is competitive and efficient based on the prices that it faces in the world market. What are the main things that we are thinking of? Of course, some of these need to be discussed more, but fundamentally we are talking about the trade and tariff environment in Sri Lanka, which has got convoluted over the last 10 years. There's no single pattern, there's a lot of ad hoc changes, there were additional tariffs and para-tariffs. Some of it disproportionately penalize small and medium enterprises. That is the number one policy instruments that we should be focusing on. Second is the regulatory environment surrounding the trade policy. What I basically mean is that we lack certain institutional legal prudences, like standards, like competition law. And also there's issues of NTB, which relates to barriers to trade. Very quickly, what are the proactive side of this trade policy? It's the market access and trade facilitation. If you look at it, I think Rajat alluded to this. It's not so much sometimes about tariff, but in Sri Lanka it is. But it is also about facilitating trade. What do I precisely mean? It means that your transaction environment, we are not in a very good situation. And when countries look at Sri Lanka, when you look at the doing business, especially the traders trading across borders indicator, we are not doing that great. We pride ourselves of being an efficient port. But beyond that, in the logistics environment, we are not doing that great. These are fundamental to get the trade in and out. By the way, trade is not all about exports. In order to export efficiently, you need to import efficiently. This whole notion about trade is about a two-way thing. One thing is about access. The other side of the coin dimension is the efficiency. That's when we get into FTAs and markets. Now, I would propose, someone would say that Sri Lanka needs markets and you can have markets everywhere. But we also have to be careful how we take, because we have only certain amount of negotiating capital. I would say that you rather enter into larger markets. It's very simple. We have our neighbor. You ask Rajat how big this Indian market is and how Indian market will evolve over time. Why am I mentioning about Indian market? Number one, it's large. Number two, it's close to being a natural trading partner. Why I say that? Because the demography and geography, you cannot override it. Go back to the history. So the evolution that will take place over the 20 years, you can't overlook these things. And the third dimension, we also have other natural trading partners. We trade with the US, we trade with the EU. They are our largest trading partners. These has to be exploited. But now we have a third stream, like Ganesh mentioned, the growing markets. That's where East Asia is. In the next 25 years, 30 years, they will generate the highest income growth in terms of trade and transaction in high value add, the more than the West would do. So it's prudent to have an East strategy. My only worry about that East strategy is whenever you sign single agreements, it adds on to the administrative cost. That's why I always prefer larger agreements. All the regimes are, if you have converge into one regime, that's much more preferable than the signing a single agreement with smaller markets. The other thing is we throw these words like global value chains and regional value chains. I spent 7 years writing a thesis about this. What I found out is that markets are usually fungible. They change, they evolve. And yes, if you can identify a certain area in the value chain, that if you sell a TV to the US and it's made in, components are made in 14 other countries. Can you wrap up, please? Yeah, sure. We wanted to make sure that it gets into an area where we are extremely good at. Now, I will skip the area where we need to take in the FDI regime. FDI regime is very important. There are some reforms that needs to be done there, and there are also reforms that needs to be done in the service market. Let me quickly move on to the next one. Now, this is something Ganesh and I have been talking about. Why TPP? Now, we've talked about several different FTAs that one can think of. What is important about the TPP is it's a fairly substantially large market. It's a market of 356 billion. What it also offers is the diversity. A diversity that it has several developed partners and several developing countries in there. So there's a good chance the trade that you do with that sort of a large market will be less diversionary. And it sort of drags on because it's technology-driven group. And the standards are one of the key things that we need to be looking at when you look at a trade agreement. Higher the standards, will drag countries who has agreements with those high standard countries along with it. It is a learning process, it will take time. This is why I think TPP is a good option. So what happens if we stay outside? It's pretty clear. There are some drivers and people who are basically exporting garments to these countries. Within the group, that will get strengthened because internal market is much more attractive. So countries like Vietnam will certainly benefit at the expense of Sri Lanka. We have 13.5% of our exports going to these TPP countries. So there has to be some effect there. The other thing is the regulatory environment. What happens is these GVCs, which we are also slightly a part of, not as much as when the TPP has US, but still there are some linkages within some number of TPP partners. We are going to lose out somewhat on some of them. We haven't assessed exactly what is that going to be. The other biggest concern is FDI diversion. TPP market has become very attractive for FDI. That will strengthen both forward linkages and backward linkages for the global value chains, at least the regional value chains. That's one area that we might lose out on. What is the evidence? The studies, computable general equilibrium studies that is done, shows that by being part of TPP, Vietnam gains 11 billion, but just sitting outside, Thailand loses 7 billion. Now, we haven't crunched our numbers to see how much it affects Sri Lanka. So just to give an example of another important agreement. So just to wrap up, the bottom line is it's about structural transformation that we are looking through the trade policy. And it is the catalyst that we are looking to set the rules of the game for the domestic market. And what we need to do to seek smart integration. But this integration has to take place along with the domestic reforms. Domestic reforms is an important thing. It is under our control. Trade agreements would take a period of time to negotiate. So there are gains to be made in the meantime by doing the type of reforms that need to be done. So among various trade agreements, we should keep our options open, not limit ourselves to a few areas, few regions. Explore the mega regional agreements if there's a way to do this. At the end of the day, one thing I wanted to wrap up is in the TPP, is the carrot. If the size of the market, now there's Twitter and rumors going on, US will eventually join the TPP. That's a game changer. That will set the stage for rules of the game in the future. So now with the nuance agreement, there's maybe a window of opportunity to get in. The message I want to wrap up with is this. I've seen this in many countries. What you don't do today, there are a lot of others would do it. But not doing it, this is the opportunity cost. You're going to get further fall behind. Thank you.
So now we'll go with Anush, Nadine, Subhashini, and Revaz. Can you please really stick to 3 minutes? Otherwise, we will not have a discussion.